The palace walls have witnessed centuries of triumph and betrayal, but never a scene as raw and devastating as this. In a single moment, the legacy of Princess Diana was shattered before her daughter-in-law's daughter, Princess Charlotte's, innocent eyes. Camilla, in a fit of rage and arrogance, destroyed a portrait that symbolized not just history, but hope. And Charlotte's tears became the haunting echo of a monarchy collapsing under its own secrets. The portrait was more than brushstrokes and canvas. It was Diana's eternal presence, preserved by those who adored her, and enshrined as one of the few treasures that carried her warmth into the future. Hung in the private gallery, it stood as a reminder of the compassion and elegance that once lit up Buckingham's coldest corridors. It wasn't simply a painting. It was a silent guardian, the one artifact that tied Diana's spirit to her children, and now to her grandchildren. For years, this portrait had been shielded, kept away from the public eye, an heirloom so delicate that only the family could truly understand its weight. But to Camilla, that weight was suffocating. Each time she walked past its gaze, she saw not art, but judgment. Diana's eyes, immortalized by the artist's hand, seemed to follow her, as though reminding her she was an intruder, wearing a crown never meant for her head. With every passing year, with every cheer from crowds that still whispered Diana's name, Camilla's resentment grew. No matter how firmly she stood beside Charles, no matter how tightly she clutched her new titles, she remained overshadowed by the woman who came before her. And the portrait was the most unbearable proof of it. That night, Charlotte had wandered into the gallery, curiosity guiding her small steps, unaware of the storm waiting inside. She had heard stories of her grandmother, of her kindness, of her love for William and Harry, of the way she had captured the hearts of millions. The portrait had always fascinated her, a chance to see what words could not fully capture. But fate placed her there at the wrong time, the exact moment when Camilla's temper reached a breaking point. The sound came first, the sharp, violent crack of the frame against marble. It echoed like thunder, rattling the silence of the gallery. The image of Diana splintered, her painted smile fractured into shards that scattered across the cold floor. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No words, no movement, just silence, as though the palace itself was stunned into mourning. That silence was heavier than words, pressing down on Charlotte's chest, suffocating her innocence. And then came the tears. Charlotte's sobs broke the stillness like glass shattering again, only louder, only deeper. This wasn't the cry of a spoiled child or a startled girl. It was the cry of a granddaughter whose link to her grandmother had just been torn apart before her eyes. Her grief filled the gallery, rising above the wreckage, a sound that pierced the heart of every staff member who heard it. In that moment, the monarchy's next generation bore the burden of its darkest wounds. Camilla stood above the ruins, her face twisted not with regret, but with bitter triumph. To her, this was liberation, one less shadow, one less reminder of a woman she could never eclipse. But what she failed to see was the damage already done. For Charlotte's tears were not hers alone. They became a symbol, an inheritance of pain passed down through bloodlines. Innocence was crushed, not by history's weight, but by power's cruelty. And though the night carried on, the palace would never be the same. For what had been destroyed was not just a portrait, but trust, respect, and the fragile threads binding the family together. The silence after the destruction lingered long after Charlotte's cries had faded, lingering in the walls, in the hearts of those who knew the truth, waiting for the moment when it would explode in scandal. But this was no ordinary tantrum. Camilla's act was deliberate, fueled by years of buried jealousy, and what followed would ignite a firestorm inside the monarchy. For years, whispers traveled through the palace corridors. Camilla could never escape Diana's ghost. Every glance, every crown jewel, every public cheer for William and Catherine carried Diana's shadow. And behind closed doors, Camilla's fury grew. The destroyed portrait was not a sudden impulse. It was the climax of a silent war that had been raging long before Charlotte ever witnessed it. Diana's presence lingered like a permanent echo, a haunting that refused to fade even decades after her passing. No matter how much Camilla tried to assert herself, the public gaze always circled back to Diana. Crowds still cheered her name in hushed reverence. Tabloids filled their pages with her legacy, and even within the palace, her memory lived on in hushed tones, in photographs kept discreetly, in stories told to the children who had never met her, yet felt her presence as though she stood among them. To the nation, Diana was more than a princess. She was an icon of love and defiance, the people's princess who refused to bend entirely to tradition. The portrait destroyed was not just painted on canvas, it was a crown of memory, a sacred reminder of who Diana had been. It carried with it more weight than any jewel or diadem. Positioned carefully within the family's private holdings, it was less a decoration and more a shrine, a reminder that the monarchy once knew warmth and vulnerability. To those who adored Diana, the portrait was a window into her enduring spirit, but to Camilla, it was a mirror that reflected all she was not. Every brushstroke whispered the cruel truth. She would always be the successor, never the legend. In private, Camilla's frustrations grew unbearable. Time and again, she found herself compared not to her own deeds but to the myth of Diana. No charity appearance, no speech, no carefully curated image could remove the shadow looming above her. Even when she tried to position herself as Charles's rightful queen, the ghost of Diana lingered, turning every triumph bitter. To the world, Camilla wore the crown. But inside those gilded walls, she often felt as though Diana still reigned. What made it worse was William and Catherine's defense of Diana's memory. They refused to let it fade. Catherine wore Diana's jewelry with elegance, ensuring her presence remained visible at every royal event. William spoke of his mother openly, his affection unyielding, his admiration still burning. Each of these gestures clashed with Camilla's authority, reminding her that no matter how many titles she collected, she could never erase the woman whose absence had become more powerful than her presence ever was. Those close to the family whispered about Camilla's private battles with the ghost of Diana. Small remarks behind closed doors, cutting comments when Diana's name surfaced, bitterness that slipped out in moments of frustration. These were not just personal grievances, they were the embers of a war, smoldering quietly while the world looked on unaware. And that portrait, radiant in its serenity, became the very symbol of the battle she could not win. The night Camilla destroyed, it was not a sudden outburst. It was the inevitable breaking point. Years of jealousy and resentment had pooled into a single act of rage. The portrait was not merely a painting to her, it was a rival, and smashing it to pieces was her attempt to claim victory, to silence the ghost that had mocked her for so long. Yet the portrait's destruction wasn't just about the past, it triggered a chain of events that would rip open the monarchy's present. She wasn't supposed to be there. Princess Charlotte wandered into the gallery at the exact moment Camilla struck, her young eyes wide with horror. And when Diana's painted face shattered, Charlotte's sobs cut through the palace like a siren. This wasn't just a child crying, it was Diana's granddaughter, carrying the pain of 2 generations, crying for a grandmother she never met but always felt. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by whispers of Diana's love. She had never seen her in life, but every bedtime story told by William and Catherine painted a picture of warmth, courage, and defiance. Catherine would share keepsakes, little tokens of Diana's presence, speaking with reverence so that Charlotte would understand her grandmother was more than history. She was family. William, though more guarded, often let slip moments of tenderness, recalling how Diana had shielded him and Harry from the harshness of royal life. In Charlotte's young heart, Diana was not just a ghost of the past, but a constant presence, a guiding spirit she carried within her. But that night, innocence was torn from her. To witness the destruction of her grandmother's image at the hands of Camilla was more than she could comprehend. It was not simply a painting falling to the floor, it was a violent rejection of the woman she had been taught to love. The crash of the frame, the tearing sound of splintering wood, and the painted fragments scattering across cold stone etched themselves into Charlotte's memory. Her innocence shattered in the same instant as the portrait, and her cry was not just grief, it was the raw sound of betrayal. Her screams tore through the halls, drawing staff into chaos. Doors burst open, footsteps raced, Whispers quickly grew into frantic alarms. The palace, so accustomed to silent scandals and carefully hidden tempests, could not contain this moment. Charlotte's cries were uncontainable, and every person who heard them knew something unspeakable had just happened. Even before the truth was spoken, the weight of tragedy hung heavy in the air. When William arrived and saw his daughter trembling, her words broken between sobs, his fury ignited instantly. To hear that Camilla had shattered the one image of Diana his daughter cherished most was unbearable. For William, it was more than an insult, it was desecration. His mind raced back to the trauma of his own childhood, to the moment he lost his mother, and now he watched his daughter bear the scars of another cruel blow tied to Diana's name. His protective rage was not the anger of a prince, but the fury of a father who had seen his child's innocence ripped away. Catherine's heartbreak was quieter, but no less devastating. She held Charlotte close, her arms a shield against the chaos, whispering comfort while her own heart fractured. To her, the wound ran deeper than a broken portrait. She saw in her daughter's tears the collision of past and present, the proof that Diana's absence still ruled the family's destiny. Catherine wept silently inside, knowing that her child's spirit had been bruised by something no child should ever have to witness. Charlotte's tears became a haunting symbol, echoing far beyond the gallery's broken silence. They were the tears of a child caught in a war between generations, a reminder that the monarchy's sins do not fade with time, but are inherited by the young. Her sobs carried the message no courtier dared to voice, that Diana's shadow had not been buried, and that the cruelty of power still scarred those too young to defend themselves. And as Charlotte wept, another storm was already brewing because William would not let this insult go unpunished. When William heard what happened, it was not just anger, it was vengeance. His mother's memory was desecrated, his daughter humiliated, and his family mocked their own home. For William, Camilla had crossed the final line, and in that moment, a private rage erupted that would threaten to break apart the monarchy itself. For years, William had carried the burden of his mother's death, the wound never fully closing. He had lived through the pain of public scrutiny, the Devance's process and its 7Ds, loneliness of childhood grief, and the unrelenting comparisons between the life Diana lived and the life he was forced to inherit. Yet he endured, choosing to channel his grief into duty. But this act of destruction against his mother's memory in front of his innocent daughter was too much. The protective father rose before the disciplined prince. Charlotte's trembling words, her tearful recount of what she had witnessed, poured gasoline on wounds that had smoldered since his youth. His fury was immediate and unstoppable. He stormed into the corridors, demanding answers, his voice carrying through the halls like thunder. When he finally confronted Camilla, the tension snapped like glass. The shouting was so fierce that staff froze where they stood, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. William's accusations poured out, fueled by a lifetime of frustration. He reminded Camilla that Diana had been loved in ways she could never replicate, and that destroying the portrait was not just an attack on the past, but on the very bloodline that carried Diana's spirit into the future. Camilla, unshaken, chose her weapon carefully with cold indifference. With a dismissive tone, she answered, "It was just a painting." Those words ignited William further. To him, it wasn't just a painting. It was his mother. It was Charlotte's inheritance. It was the one piece of Diana that still breathed within the palace walls. By calling it nothing, Camilla had turned years of quiet hostility into open war. Palace staff, trained to maintain silence in the face of scandal, found themselves stunned. They had never seen William so openly defiant, so willing to let his rage spill into the open. Whispers quickly spread beyond the gallery, trickling into drawing rooms and service quarters, igniting fear that the monarchy itself had cracked. What had been private bitterness was now a battlefield for all to see. In that moment, seeds of rebellion were planted. William was no longer the son torn between father and duty. He became the avenger, the protector, the one willing to fight for his mother's memory and his daughter's innocence, even if it meant challenging the very structure of the crown itself. For the first time, the unspoken conflict between William and Camilla burst into daylight, and neither would retreat. But William wasn't alone, because Catherine's quiet strength turned Charlotte's tears into a rallying cry against Camilla's reign. She didn't need to raise her voice. Catherine's silence was more powerful than 1,000 words. While Charlotte cried and William raged, Catherine's steady gaze on Camilla was enough to pierce the air. It was the look of a mother who would protect her child at any cost, and a woman who refused to let Diana's memory be destroyed. That silence was the true beginning of a rebellion. In the middle of chaos, Catherine became the still point. She pulled Charlotte close, whispering calm into her daughter's ears, while William's fury shook the palace walls. The sound of her daughter's sobs echoed against her heart, but Catherine knew one thing. Her child needed strength, not fear. She bent down, smoothing Charlotte's hair, reminding her through touch alone that she was safe, that no matter the violence of others, her mother's love would not break. That small act of comfort carried a power greater than all the shouts around them. Yet Catherine's calmness was more than maternal instinct. It was symbolic. In her silence, she became Diana's heir, not by bloodline but by spirit. Diana had embodied grace under fire, strength without cruelty, and dignity in the face of humiliation. Now, years later, Catherine stood in that same place. She carried the torch, not through words, but through presence. The staff, the family, and even the walls themselves seemed to sense that Catherine was no longer simply a supporting figure. She was the quiet force shaping the monarchy's future. And then came the gaze. As William and Camilla exchanged venomous words, Catherine's eyes locked onto Camilla's. It was not loud, it was not violent, but it was devastating. In that look, Catherine said everything she did not need to speak aloud. You will not destroy her. You will not erase Diana. You will not touch what belongs to us. Camilla, for all her bravado, faltered under it. That gaze exposed her cruelty, laid it bare for everyone in the room to see. The silence itself became a weapon. In a family where noise, speeches, and pronouncements ruled, Catherine's refusal to join in the shouting carried even more weight. Her silence cut through Camilla's justification, rendering words meaningless. It placed her not on the battlefield of insults but on the throne of moral authority. Staff who had watched countless royal disputes knew at that moment that Catherine had claimed a power no crown could give. She had captured the soul of the family's future. And from that silence, a realization spread. Catherine would never abandon Diana's memory. She had chosen her side, and it was not with the crown, nor with politics, but with the truth. Diana had lived and died for love, dignity, and family. It was a declaration without sound, a rebellion without banners, and it shook those who witnessed it. For Catherine was no longer just William's wife. She had become the anchor of the monarchy, the one figure who could endure storms and still hold the family together. But as Catherine held her ground, another royal figure would rise, one who had witnessed too many betrayals to remain silent. Princess Anne had always been the monarchy's iron pillar, unbothered by gossip or scandal. But when she learned Camilla had destroyed Diana's portrait in front of Charlotte, her patience snapped. For Anne, this was not just an insult to Diana. It was a violation of the monarchy itself. And when Anne speaks, even kings tremble. For decades, Anne had carried herself as the royal, family's quiet enforcer, a woman of steel who valued duty above all else. But beneath that hard exterior lived a loyalty that could not be shaken. Her loyalty to Diana. Anne had admired Diana's courage, her ability to soften the monarchy's image, and the love she poured into William and Harry when the institution often gave them coldness instead of care. Though Anne rarely displayed affection openly, she carried a deep respect for Diana's role, and she never forgave those who tried to tarnish her memory. Her history with Camilla had always been tense, though carefully hidden. Anne tolerated her presence but never embraced her as family. There were moments of clipped remarks, of sharp glances across gilded tables, of whispers passed through staff about Anne's refusal to bend fully to Camilla's influence. For years, Anne kept her grievances contained, understanding that open conflict could destabilize the monarchy. But this destruction of Diana's portrait was the unforgivable spark that reignited years of quiet resistance. What infuriated her most was the impact on Charlotte. To Anne, the monarchy's children were its only hope for survival. She had watched the younger generation struggle under the weight of public expectation, and she had made it her mission to protect them from the institution's darkest impulses. Learning that Charlotte, innocent and unprepared, had been forced to watch her grandmother's likeness smashed in a fit of Camilla's rage was enough to make Anne abandon restraint. The thought of that little girl crying in the gallery, traumatized by a feud older than her own lifetime, was intolerable. When Anne confronted Camilla, it was not in public spectacle but in the shadowed corridors of the palace, where truth could be spoken without courtly masks. Her words were sharp, her tone unyielding. She told Camilla directly that Diana's memory was untouchable, that no act of destruction could erase the woman who had captured the heart of the nation. Camilla attempted to defend herself, to dismiss it as nothing more than broken wood and paint, but Anne cut her off with the authority of someone who had lived through too many betrayals. In that moment, Anne was not just a sister or an aunt. She was the voice of tradition, of consequence, of reckoning. Later, Anne sought out William. She placed her hand on his shoulder and with quiet certainty told him, "This won't be forgotten." Those words carried more than comfort, they carried promise, a vow that she would stand with him, that Camilla's cruelty would not vanish into silence, that justice within the family would one day come. William, still seething with grief and fury, found in his aunt's words a steel that matched his own. What Anne may not have said aloud, but everyone around her understood, was that this incident was bigger than a family feud. It was about succession, about the future of the monarchy, about whether Camilla's influence could endure or whether the tides were shifting toward a new generation. Anne's anger did not just call out an insult, it foreshadowed a battle over the crown itself. But Anne's fury was only one piece of the storm, because King Charles himself was forced to face the collapse of his fragile household. For King Charles, the destruction of Diana's portrait was more than a family crisis. It was a national humiliation. Torn between his wife and his son, his past and his future, Charles stood on the edge of collapse. To defend Camilla meant betraying his children. To side with William meant destroying his marriage. And in the shadows of Diana's broken portrait, Charles's crown suddenly felt heavier than ever before. The storm inside him was relentless. As a husband, he was bound to protect Camilla, the woman he had chosen, the woman for whom he had endured decades of criticism. Yet, as a father, he could not ignore William's fury or Charlotte's heartbreak. Each side pulled at him with equal force, leaving him suspended in a torment that no crown could shield him from. His heart told him one thing, his duty demanded another, and for the first time in years, Charles felt the crushing loneliness of kingship. What made it worse was the ghost that had never left Diana. The image of her face, once loving and later pained, returned to him in waves. Her memory, resurrected in every headline and every public gathering, was now thrust violently before him through the portrait's destruction. His guilt resurfaced like a wound torn open again. He had failed her once in life, and now, through his silence, he risked failing her again in death. Each passing hour whispered the same accusation, that he had built his reign upon a grave he could never escape. The outside world, though not yet privy to every detail, could already sense the fracture. Charles's silence became a weapon used against him. Commentators asked why the king had not condemned the act, why he had not spoken in defense of the family's dignity. To many, his refusal to act looked like complicity. The public perception was brutal. He seemed weak, incapable of controlling his own household, unworthy of guiding a nation. The monarchy's most fragile point had been laid bare, and Charles was at the center of it. Behind closed doors, his advisors urged him to think not as a father or a husband but as a sovereign. They pleaded with him to protect the monarchy's image, to issue a carefully worded statement that would quell public suspicion. But Charles could not bring himself to choose. Every word he rehearsed died on his tongue. He knew that one misstep would either fracture his marriage or alienate his son forever. His crown, once the prize of a lifetime, had become an unbearable weight pressing against his conscience. In a strained private meeting with William, the air turned heavy. William demanded action, his voice laced with anger that only a wounded son could carry. He wanted acknowledgement, respect for his mother's memory, and justice for his daughter. Charles, trembling beneath the weight of his dual roles, offered words that rang hollow even to himself. It was a conversation that ended without resolution, only widening the gulf between father and son. In the silence of his chambers, Charles confronted the fear he had long tried to bury, that his legacy would not be one of unity, but of destruction. The image of his reign, already shadowed by controversy, now risked being remembered as the era in which the monarchy tore itself apart from within. He looked at the crown not as a symbol of triumph, but as a shackle binding him to choices he could never make without loss. And while Charles wrestled with his conscience, the public would soon learn the truth, turning private betrayal into worldwide scandal. It began as whispers among staff, but within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Camilla had destroyed Diana's portrait before Charlotte. The image of a child crying for her grandmother became the nation's wound. Outrage poured into the streets, headlines screamed betrayal, and the monarchy faced its most dangerous scandal since Diana's funeral. The people were no longer silent, they demanded justice. The leak to the press was inevitable. Servants who had witnessed the chaos, shaken by Charlotte's sobs and the broken fragments of Diana's portrait, could not contain what they had seen. Within a day, tabloids were ablaze with the shocking account. Camilla smashes Diana's portrait before Princess Charlotte read one headline, while another called it, "The Night Diana Was Betrayed Again." The story was no longer confined to palace walls. It had erupted into public consciousness, and with it came a tidal wave of fury. Emotional headlines fueled the fire, each article pushing the narrative deeper into the nation's heart. Pictures of Diana resurfaced across front pages, her image juxtaposed against a furious Camilla and a heartbroken Charlotte. The symbolism was undeniable. The public interpreted the destruction not as an accident, but as a calculated act of cruelty, an assault not only on Diana's memory, but on the family that carried her legacy. It was no longer about a painting, it was about what the act represented. Citizens began to demand Camilla's removal. Protests swelled outside royal residences, voices chanting for her to step aside, their placards declaring her unfit to wear the crown. For many, this was the final proof that Camilla would never escape the shadow of Diana, nor deserve the position she had fought so hard to claim. The nation's patience had snapped, and the monarchy once again found itself at the mercy of public rage. Online movements magnified the scandal. Hashtags erupted worldwide, with millions posting side-by-side images of Diana's radiant compassion and Camilla's perceived ruthlessness. Memes mocked the queen consort, while tributes to Diana flooded digital platforms. In every corner of the internet, the debate was fierce, but the verdict was clear. Diana's memory had triumphed, and Camilla's reputation lay in ashes. Global media joined the chorus, painting Charlotte as the spiritual heir of Diana. The sight of a young princess crying in defense of her grandmother's memory became a rallying image for millions. Commentators declared that history was repeating itself, that just as Diana had stood as the people's princess, Charlotte had inadvertently become the symbol of the monarchy's conscience. The world's gaze turned not to Charles, not to Camilla, but to William, Catherine, and their children, as the true heart of the crown. And with the outcry came calls for change. Citizens, commentators, and even political figures began to urge William and Catherine to take the throne sooner. They argued that the nation deserved leadership untainted by scandal, that the crown should pass to the generation embodying Diana's legacy rather than clinging to the past. The monarchy was not simply in crisis, it stood at the brink of transformation. And as the scandal consumed the nation, one final revelation would decide the monarchy's fate forever. Just when it seemed the monarchy could not fall any lower, a hidden truth emerged. That portrait of Diana wasn't just painted on canvas, it contained a secret letter, hidden in the frame, left by Diana herself. And when the frame shattered under Camilla's rage, the letter spilled out. Its words would not only vindicate Diana's memory, but expose a truth that threatened to topple the crown itself. The discovery was nothing short of extraordinary. As shards of glass and splintered wood lay scattered across the gallery floor, a folded piece of paper slid free from the ruined frame. At first, no one noticed, but when staff gathered the debris, the letter's aged parchment caught their eyes. The handwriting was unmistakable. Diana's elegant script, preserved as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. What had been hidden in silence for decades was now laid bare through Camilla's act of destruction. The contents were devastating. Diana's words, written in secrecy, revealed her fears for her sons, her worry that the institution would consume them, and her plea for their future to remain guided by love rather than ambition. She spoke of her hope that William would inherit not just a crown but compassion, and that Harry would never be abandoned in the shadows. These were not the musings of a princess. They were the warnings of a mother who knew her time was short and her sons' lives would forever be shaped by forces beyond their control. For William, reading those words was like hearing his mother's voice again, echoing across the years. It broke him and strengthened him all at once. The letter confirmed what he had always suspected, that Diana had seen the storm coming long before it arrived. Her warnings were not vague. They were precise. A mirror held up to the monarchy's present crisis. And for Charlotte, though too young to fully understand, clutching the paper became an emotional bond with the grandmother she had cried for only hours before. It was as though Diana had reached through time to comfort her granddaughter in her darkest moment. Camilla, however, stood frozen in horror. Her attempt to erase Diana's presence had unleashed it in a form more powerful than she could ever have imagined. What she thought would silence the ghost only amplified it, giving Diana's memory not just sentiment, but tangible proof of her foresight. Every eye in the palace turned toward Camilla, not with respect, but with blame. Her rage had revealed the very weapon that could dismantle everything she had fought to gain. The monarchy itself trembled beneath the weight of Diana's words. Advisors whispered of their explosive impact, fearing that once made public, the letter could shatter whatever trust remained in the crown. Diana's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, had become the ultimate reckoning, a truth so sharp it threatened to slice through tradition, loyalty, and authority. Her prophecy was not abstract. It pointed directly to the fracture between Charles, William, and the institution they represented. And in that moment, it became clear that Diana's spirit would guide the monarchy long after her passing. Her letter was more than a message. It was a map, a compass pointing toward a future built not on Camilla's ambition, but on the enduring love Diana had planted in her children. The very act meant to destroy her memory had only ensured her eternal influence. And as Charlotte held that letter close, the palace finally understood the child's tears were not weakness, but the prophecy of a crown forever haunted by Diana's shadow. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.